Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Matsukevich Gambit, which derives from the Alekhine Defense, which starts out with e4, and then knight f6. Pawn typically just pushes forward with e5, attacking the knight, knight to d5, and then just continuing to put pressure on that knight with c4, knight to b6, the most common move. And now white has a few options. One of the most common ones is d4. But right behind that, you could just play c5, attacking the knight. Knight's usually just going to come back to d5 in the center of the board. White can no longer attack it with the pawns, so knight to c3. It's pretty standard here. After black exchange and white takes on c3, now the main line for black is to play d6. White is now going to play the move bishop to g5. And this is the Matsukevich Gambit that we're going to be going over today. It has an extremely high win rate, and you'll start to see how difficult it is for black to play. Now, I was running through databases to see how often this position arises, and the most common response from black, even if you put it through the engine, is to play pawn takes on e5. And this is really where the fun starts for white, because if you look at it and say, well, I don't really see how white's going to get a huge advantage here. The queens exchange off the board. Yeah, black can't castle anymore after the king takes here, but once the queens comes off the board, it doesn't really matter if you can castle or not. But white's not looking to castle. Instead, they're going to play the move queen b3. Now, this bishop on g5, it looks somewhat out of place. It's not really attacking the weak square on f7, which is typically the square you want to attack for white early in the game. The queen is on b3 for sure, but the bishop is not. So what is the bishop doing, and what are the threats that white actually has? So that's what we're going to be going over today. What I like about this gambit is it's one of those that if you can play it against your opponent, which if you play against the Alekhine Defense, you will have a lot of opportunities, because none of the lines that we looked at were really that crazy. It really just comes down to if you want to continue to chase that knight away instead of playing d4 early on, you'll get a chance to play this, but you'll really see that black has a difficult time dealing with it. Let's look at some of the threats. You can see immediately we're pinning down this pawn on e7 to the queen. So they can't just play, e6. We would take their queen. That would be a disastrous move. Let's kind of go through some of the other terrible moves they could have, and then we'll look at the best move for black, which I think is difficult to find. So one option they have is knight c6. This is probably their worst option, but it'll start to give you an idea of the threats that white has. White can now play the move rook to d1. This is attacking the queen. You can start to see the queen doesn't have a lot of good options as far as where it is going to go. So let's look at a few of them. One is bishop to e6. Is okay, if you're going to take my queen, I'm going to take your queen as well. But unfortunately, this exchange is not going to work out. We can play queen takes on b7. We're still attacking their queen. Okay, so how do they stop this? If they just bring their bishop back d7, well, the exchange is not going to work. We take their bishop, they take our rook, we take their rook on a8, check, and then they definitely don't want to exchange queens because we're up in material and we want to exchange down. They don't want to, so maybe knight d8. This knight's awkwardly placed. That's not going to be good. And then we play knight f3. We're up in material and we should have a very easy endgame from here. If we come back, if they decide, okay, I don't want to play bishop e6, that's not going to be a good trade for us. What if they just play bishop d7? Anytime they move that bishop off of this c8 square, they're just setting themselves up for so much pain. If they come to e6, we took on b7, but here what they've also neglected is the f7 square. So now we can play bishop to c4. Now we're eyeing down both our queen and our bishop on the f7 square. We already talked about they cannot play e6, which is what they want to play, because that leaves their queen hanging on d8. So we have this threat here in the center of the board. Neither of their pawns on d or the e file can stop this. They don't have their knight that started on g8 to stop this threat. So how do they really do anything? The knight on c6 can't stop it. They don't have a lot of good options from here. Maybe they play queen c8, just trying to give their king some square to go to. Okay, well, now we can just take with our bishop on f7. Now their king can't castle. We still have our queen, so it's not going to be good for black. You can see the king is now on an open file with our rook on d1. This is not going to be good. We can get more material involved into the game, and there's no safe squares now for black to continue. They can't get their pawn out to e6 to get their dark square bishop involved. It's being pinned down by the bishop here. We can get our knight involved here. You can see we're adding a lot of pressure. This bishop on d7 is pinned down. The queen's not going anywhere. Neither of the rooks are going anywhere as well. So that's what happens if early on they play that knight to c6. Not going to be a good option. The next option that you could see is just the move f6, attacking the bishop here on g5. Now, what's nice is for white, we can pretty much disregard this bishop because we have a stronger attack, and that is bring the rook over here to d1. That's why it's so important. You bring your queen to b3, attacking the weak square on f7, and then that opens up. You can get your rook over to d1, and this d file is completely open. Okay, so how do they stop this? Well, now because their knight's not on c6, it does have the option. They can either defend the square on d7 with their bishop or their knight. So let's look at both of them. First, we'll look at bishop to d7. I like to think of this as black loses quickly, where knight to d7, black loses slowly. But we'll look at both options. You can really see how bad this gets for black here. Bishop d7, blocking this. But now, as soon as they play their bishop, you've probably seen this before, we take on b7. Now, they could take our bishop, yes, but now we can take their rook. That's definitely going to be a better exchange for us. And now they've opened up their king side of the board. This F file is no longer secure for them. And their king's in the center of the board with their dark square bishop still in a tough spot. Maybe now they play e6 to open up for their dark square bishop. We can play b4. This solidifies this pawn structure. So this bishop can't really go anywhere. Yeah, I could come to e7 potentially. But now we just play f3. We're attacking the pawn on e5. We can gobble up material here on e7 if we want to. We can centralize our queen. We're still pinning down this bishop on d7 from our rook to the queen. So they just have a tough spot here. And yes, they can castle on the king side, but they don't really have a good solid structure. And since we are up in material, since we took their rook, we should have an easy endgame from here. Now, if we come back, instead of bishop d7, what if they play knight to d7? This is what I like to think of is if black wants to lose a long game, where bishop to d7, I think it's more of a quicker loss. Because now white has a really fun move, and that is queen e6. And it gets pretty tricky for black. Before, we had queen on b3, and we're looking to bring our bishop to c4, where now we can reverse it. Anytime your bishop is supporting your queen, the threat gets even crazier for black to deal with. Because once we get our bishop to c4, it's pretty much game over unless there's a way for this king to move. They almost have to play c6, because without that, how are they really going to continue? Remember, if they look at it and say, well, I'll just go ahead and attack this queen. I'll just take this knight or this pawn on c5 with my knight. Remember, that knight is pinned down by our rook here. So yes, we can take their queen. They can't just take our queen back. This is check. So this is a really, really tough predicament that we are putting them in. They really need to be playing c6 in this spot. From here, we're going to continue bishop c4, threatening mate on f7. They kind of need to play their queen out to a5 just so their king can come to this d8 square. We can play bishop to e3, defending the square on c5. Now their bishop here on f8 is kind of blocked off. It's not a great square. And so you can see their king is going to be stuck in the center of the board here, and we're attacking the center of the board. Our bishop and queen are eyeing down this f7 square. They're probably going to play king to d8. We could play knight to e2, start to rearrange where our knight's going. It can come to g3, then e4, and then really start to put a lot of pressure on our opponents. It can even come up here to f5 and start to attack some of these critical squares on e7 and g7. So we have a ton of options of how we are going to continue in this spot. This all comes back to if they decide early on, hey, we play queen to b3, and they say, hey, let's go ahead and attack that bishop on g5. It's just not going to work out great for them. Next option we're going to look at is instead of knight to c6 and pawn f6, what if they play their bishop? Now, if they play bishop to e6, you've probably seen this story before. They attack our queen. We just come up and take on b7. As soon as they play their queen, or their bishop, and they're not defending the pawn on f7, we can just come up here, take this pawn on b7, and we are in a good spot. Now, since we're attacking the rook, they're probably going to play knight to d7, but then we can castle on the queen side. Gives us, it's kind of the same thing as far as getting the rook to d1, but hey, it also gives us a little safer path for our king. Also allows us to really throw everything if we want to on the king side of the board and not have to worry about a late game saving from our king from just a structure standpoint. They could play rook b8 attacking our queen. That's fine. We can just play queen c6. Now we're putting the queen and the rook both on this d7 square. The knight can no longer move. It's not just pinned down from the rook to the queen, but now it's pinned down to the king, and so it definitely can't move. This bishop, it's really in a tough spot. It was attacking our queen, but now it's in no man's land, so that can't go anywhere. Maybe they now decide, okay, I need to get my bishop here to g7, castle on the king side. But while they're trying to just save playing defense, we can just develop our pieces. Knight to f3 here, bishop g7. We could play bishop comes back to e3. They could castle on the king side, but as soon as our bishop comes back, this also opens up for a knight to come to g5. They could play bishop f5. We could play h3. And then they have a couple options here. One is if they play e4. You may say, well, why do they play e4? The whole reason is once we come up to g4, now this knight can come to e5. Before, when the pawn was on e5, it could not. And so this now gives us the option. Once they've castled on the king side, they don't have to worry too much about us taking their queen with check. They've castled. That's no longer a threat. We've kind of looked at that one. So pawn e4, but we're going to come up here to g4. Then they played knight e5. But then we take their queen. They take our queen. But then we take on f8. They take on f8. And then we take the material on f5. This exchange does not work out for them at all. Rook to g1. Now it's on this open file. This is going to be extremely bad for black. Now, if we come back, if we play h3, maybe they decide to play h5 instead. Okay, great. We can still just push up with g4. Yes, we could see an exchange right here, but after they take, we have a lot of threats here as well. We could even just play bishop to h3 here if we want to, because now we have our knights on g5. We've opened up the h file. We can get both of our rooks on the h file. We just have a ton of threats that they are going to have to deal with. It's going to be very, very difficult. This is why I say that this is kind of the losing on the long approach. Black more than likely is going to lose with all the threats that white has, but it does take a little bit longer for white to actually win this game. So let's come back to the very beginning of this. After queen to b3, the best move for black so that they don't just lose automatically is kind of an odd move, but it's queen to d7. Remember, the main theme around this for white is this bishop on g5 and the queen on b3, because we can bring our rook to d1, really puts their queen in a tough spot. And because their queen's in a tough spot, they just can't do a ton. So getting their queen to d7 is the best play. But that's fine. We can just play knight to f3. It's going to be more of a regular development from us. We're attacking the pawn on e5. We can get our light square bishop involved into the game, similar to the other variations with c4. We can castle on the king side. Can't castle through check, so not going to be castling on the queen side. But this is going to be a very solid structure for white. And you can see black's already blocking off their light square bishop. Okay, well, if they want to play pawn e6, they have a kind of an awkward structure with double pawns on the e file just to get their dark square bishop involved into the game to castle. So I think it's going to be difficult even for black to continue in this position, even if they know the best move, which is queen d7. Just doesn't feel like it's that great for black. So this is why that if you get to play this, white has such a high win percentage. There's just so many lines that white's going to be better off. So really enjoy this variation in Alekhine Defense. So if you go up against it, I definitely recommend trying this out. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you wouldn't mind just leaving a comment in the bottom, let me know if you enjoyed it. If there's any other openings you want me to do a video on, or if there's any other types of videos, please let me know that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.